Well, Rosemary, thank you so much for being here with me on the Entrepreneurial Success Podcast. This was one in the making because you and I already have a little bit of history together, which we'll catch up on a little bit, and everybody will get to hear about it. But for just the time being, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Thank you so much for having me on your show today. I am a podcast editor and podcast manager. And what that means is I help my clients launch, manage, and grow their podcast. Podcasting is, of course, a very, very big thing, especially after the last 18 months or so of COVID. And everyone is jumping on the podcasting wagon. I will share tips later on as to how you might be able to do the same. But I play an integral part in helping my clients get their podcasts out there, grow their listenership, make an impact, increase revenue. So many different options are available in podcasting.
I know. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to get you on the podcast, because I've got a huge passion for my podcast. And for the listeners out there, if you don't know, well, big news, Rosemary is my podcast VA. So she does all the podcast editing for me and all of those nooks and crannies and little things, which I absolutely love because she's just amazing in what she does. But I think, Rosemary, what I'm really interested in at this moment is just, I want to know about your story. How did you get started in podcasting and how did you become a podcast VA?
Well, so I've been in business for coming up to a year now. It's gone really, really quick. My background is as an executive assistant. So I have worked for usually C-suite board members, so quite senior, for lots of different companies, private, public, voluntary, usually in central London. And probably like a lot of people, COVID gave me that headspace, that time to kind of think about the future, what I wanted. As with everyone else, I started to work from home, really, really loved it, but knew that once everything had sort of settled down, I wouldn't be able to work from home long term. I managed an office, so it just wouldn't work. And yeah, about August 2020, I started to do some research. I was actually looking for a virtual PA role, so still employed by someone else, but had the flexibility and freedom to work from home, do the work, that kind of stuff. And long story short, because I can talk about my story for hours, I found a VA course during my search on Reed and took a masterclass the following morning, bought the course and finished the course over the weekend and spent the last 3 weeks of August just getting my business set up. I worked with female coaches then as well, started out as a general VA. And then by about, I think it was October, November, one of my clients, I call her a pro podcast guest because today, as we're speaking now, she's probably been on about 60, 70 podcasts as a guest in the last 12, 13 months or so. So I started working with her in terms of repurposing those episodes, pulling quotes for her, and creating a vault, creating her website for her. So putting all the different episodes on her website. And naturally, I went down what is a podcast? How does a podcast show up on my phone? That whole sort of Google rabbit hole that we all go down when we're researching stuff. And then over Christmas, I took a podcast manager course. And the rest, as they say, is history. I niched down and pivoted for the new year. And yeah, I've been doing it for 8 months now, and it's fantastic. I did love being a VA, still have a couple of VA clients who also have a podcast, but this just allows me to be creative and really draw on my strengths around, planning ahead and coordination and just taking someone's vision and making it a reality. So I absolutely love it.
Yeah. And this is something that I found as well about you when you and I started working together. Your passion for what you're doing is just so equivalent. And I can just see it when you talk about it. Every time we have a conversation, you get so excited about doing things and putting things together. And I'm like, yes, that's great. Just do it. That's great. Go for it. So no, I love it. And for me in particular, because podcasting is such a huge part of my business, oh my gosh, I can honestly tell everybody, if this is the first time you're hearing my story, starting out with my podcast, again, was not the best thing in the beginning. It was horrendous. Nothing was in place. I didn't have episodes scheduled. I didn't have content, but I knew I wanted a podcast. And I just kept on going on that journey. So it was very hard to start with, and I made so many mistakes. But here I am. I mean, we're going for episodes over the 120s,
Mm-hmm.
122 almost. And I'm very proud of myself, but it didn't start that way. So I want to ask you, Rosemarie, I think this is the thing, is what do people need to consider to get into place, for starting a podcast, so to speak? What is it that you can share with them?
So in terms of starting your own podcast, you've touched on one key thing, and that's consistency. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people are jumping on the podcast train, which is great for me and, great for people all over the world. But at the same time, do you have the time? Mm-hmm. Because as business owners, we have a lot going on. We've got the business, we're trying to grow and scale the business. We've got family, we've got friends, we've got, as women, we've got a lot of stuff going on. So does the podcast fit into your marketing strategy? A podcast is great because you can create lots of different content from the podcast. But at the same time, I'm very clear. So when I have calls with potential clients, one of my questions is around, are you ready for the long game? And you just mentioned that, like 120 odd episodes. It's definitely a long game, and you have to maintain that consistency throughout, because as time goes on, you will start to grow a following, an audience. And if you slip, you will lose that audience just as quickly. Of course, communicate with them, but it's super, super important that you remain consistent. So starting out, I always kind of have that conversation. Even when I started my own, I was like, do I have time for this? What can I get rid of that the podcast could replace? So if the answer to your question, that question is no, then you might think, what can the podcast replace? For some people, the podcast replaces a blog, especially if that person doesn't really enjoy writing, but they feel like they need to have, I was in that place and I was like, I don't even like writing. Why am I going to write a blog? But the podcast, as I mentioned, you can pull so much content. For an example, you can create Facebook Lives, you can create videos for your membership, you could create a blog, you could create social media captions for all the different platforms. There's so much more that you can do with it. So the big thing is time. And another thing will be why. Ask yourself or think about, why do you want to start a podcast? Because there is FOMO. FOMO is very real. I am guilty of it to a certain extent. Like, I feel like, oh my gosh, this course runs once a year, I must do it now. So, we're all guilty of it. But because of what I've already mentioned, you want to make sure that your why is solid, because when podcasting becomes hard, and there will be pockets of hardship, where, for example, you're thinking, oh, my listeners aren't growing, or who do I interview? Or I'm not getting guests through. There will be, how do I monetize? I'm not getting the opportunities that I thought I was going to get. There's so many different avenues, but what's your why? So the same with when you're starting a business. It doesn't have to be anything, major, but what is your why? How does it factor in to your business? So for me, those are the top 2 or 3 things. So consistency, you're thinking about your why, and time.
Yeah.
Do you have it?
Yeah, I mean, for me in particular, as you were saying that, I resonated with every one of those. The consistency, oh my goodness, in the beginning, I think I only in the beginning, when I started my podcast, I did solo episodes.
Right.
And then I would set out an episode and it would take forever to record it, because I would be a perfectionist. I would be tweaking things the whole time. And then finally an episode was released. But then about 2 weeks went by, and then I was like, oh my gosh, I need to create something else to go out on the podcast. And then finally I got another episode out, and it just literally trickled out, and I was not consistent. And I see all these other people having this amazing success with their podcast. I'm like, what are they doing that I'm not doing? And obviously consistency, big aha moment. But then what I like about what you said is the time. For me, the time aspect was, it had to fit in my strategy, number one, but also because, like you, I don't like blogging, or I wouldn't say I don't like blogging, it's just not one of my strengths.
Yeah.
So the way for me to get content out there was through my podcast. And I absolutely enjoy this. I mean, I talk a lot, and my husband will agree with me 100% when I say that. But that's what I enjoy doing. So for me, it made more sense to go out and use my podcast to get the audience to listen to what it is that I had to say. And the biggest why for me was I realized and I knew that I wanted to get content out there, but I didn't have a why then. Until one day I got an email from a person in my audience, and this filled my heart with so much love. And she said, I listened to every single one of your podcast episodes because I just feel so good and so energetic after listening to them. I just feel like I'm on the right path. And if I just listen to what you're saying and implementing it, I can really make a success in my business.
That's amazing.
That was the first time where I realized why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And actually it brings me tears to my eyes just talking about it. But I was just like so overwhelmed with, oh my gosh, people are listening. I didn't think that people would be listening. I didn't think that it would make an impact, but it does.
Yes.
And that's where my why became so much stronger. So I love the fact that you're saying it, because I resonate personally towards each and every one of those.
That's fantastic. And that's what it's all about, because you are sharing your message. And there are people who have imposter syndrome is a big thing. They will be like, oh, will anyone listen to my show? Who wants to hear my voice? I even had a call with someone yesterday, and she said to me, there's so many business coaches, what's going to make mine unique? And I know it's something that people think, but to hear those words, I had to just say, stop. You are what's going to make your show unique. There could be thousands of business coaches with a podcast, but they're not you. There could be loads of mindset and marketing coaches, podcasts out there, but the way you deliver your value, the way you deliver your content is going to be hugely different. So don't worry about what everyone else is doing. Just do you. If it is the right fit. A podcast isn't for everyone. For lots of different reasons. One reason might be that your audience don't even listen to podcasts. So you might want to do a bit of market research and make sure that, you know, a podcast is something that they want. If you've already got like a Facebook group or an email list, do a bit of research with that existing audience. But don't think, oh, everyone's hopping on a podcast train, so I must too. Make sure it makes sense and it fits into your overall business plan.
Yeah, I agree with you. This is, again, FOMO, as you mentioned earlier. People are having this fear of missing out. It's like the podcast train is happening. Okay, news alert. The podcast train has been happening for a long
while.
Okay, it's not just happening right now. It's been going on for a long, long time. So whether you start now, whether you start next month, whether you start next year, it doesn't matter. But if you find that it is aligned with you, then just start with it. It's not because, and I've heard this because so many people say, oh my goodness, you've got 120 odd episodes. That's amazing. I could never see myself get there. And it's like, I never saw myself getting there. When I reached episode 10, I was already celebrating. That to me was huge. Yeah. But then I just kept with the consistency, and I just kept going and going. And my podcast has been building over 3 years. Yeah. Like I said in the beginning, I was not consistent. So if you do the numbers, you'll figure out how inconsistent I was in the beginning. But then after that, I've got an episode going out every single Thursday. Yeah. And I make sure that it is ready for my audience, and it is what my audience wants. That is equally the other important thing. So I want to ask you, do you have a couple of tips for the audience about what it is that they need to look at before they start getting a podcast together? Because there's so many things that people always query as to, what do I need to start a podcast? So there's a couple of things they need to look at beforehand before they just jump in, basically. Yes.
So a couple things to ask yourself. Again, why, which we've already talked about. Why do you want to start a podcast? As you mentioned, just making sure it aligns with you, with your business plan, etc. But then also stop and think about what you're going to talk about. It has to be something that you're so passionate about. You can sit and talk about it for 60 minutes, 90 minutes. I mean, you don't want a podcast to be too long. But my point being, it has to be something that you're so passionate about, you can talk about it at, a drop of a hat. And usually that would be something that you're already doing, the reason why you're a business owner, the reason why you're an entrepreneur. So if you're a mindset coach, you might want to start a podcast about giving mindset tips and having certain guests on to share that knowledge, that value. So that's another important bit. It's also thinking about what format your podcast might take. There's so many different formats. Of course, the most popular two are solo, like you mentioned. A lot of people do start off solo to just get a bit of a feel, find their feet. And then you might want to start interviewing guests. Interviewing guests is a magnificent thing because you are sharing your podcast with the audience, and that's how you help it to grow. But I appreciate that that's not for every person and for every show. So think about what your format might look like. Also, a big thing, I did this myself, and I don't say it to my clients, but I did it myself. You might want to start, I call this, I've got like a 4-step, the 4 Ps, I call them. And for me, this would be in the prep stage. So you've decided, yes, a podcast is coming up my to-do list. I want to get started. Where do I start, like you mentioned? So it's the prep phase. That's the first step. And within the prep, it's all the stuff I mentioned about why, format, topics. And then in terms of topics, what I did with my own show is I've mapped out 56 topics. I've got a Trello board for my podcast, and I've got 56 topics. I'm sorted for a year because I'm doing a weekly show.
Amazing.
So whilst I recommend to people to batch record, which you do, which is fantastic. I've batched my topics. I might only batch 2 episodes at a time, recording wise, but I've got all these topics. And then sometimes I just get inspiration and I'll add. So I'll probably pass to 56 now. So just think, you might not want to do 56, but as a minimum, think about 10. Because if you're going to do a weekly podcast, you want to launch with at least 4 or 5, and we'll come on to why that will be in a moment. And then you've got another 5 in the vault, so to speak. So it's all about kind of setting yourself up for success so that we're all busy in our lives, as we discussed. So if you've at least got the topics, you're not scrambling for ideas. Although even though you're passionate about your topic, you probably won't be scrambling, but it's just helpful to have all the topics laid out. So for me, those are the sort of the basics to kind of get started. What is it going to look like? So you've decided to launch a podcast. Now we need to get to nitty gritty. What is it going to look like? And then in terms of equipment, I like to say that a podcast is as expensive as you want to make it. You do not need to go out and create a fancy studio with soundproof walls. You don't need to do it. If you've got the budget to do that, by all means, go for it. But, if you want to spend money sensibly, because there are other aspects of the podcast, like you need to pay for a host, that's where your podcast lives. A bit like when you have a website, you might be with a hosting provider. So there's other things that are non-negotiable. So when it comes to equipment, definitely a mic, definitely headphones. Today, you'll see that I'm using the ones that have come with my phone, and I have a Blue Yeti mic, which is around the £120 mark, but you can definitely get the Blue Snowball, which is around the £60 mark. So there are mics that are very, very affordable, but those are my top 2 things. And then of course a laptop, because you need to be able to record as we are now. So those are the 3 things that are must-haves. And then there are other things. For example, you'll see on my screen this black round thing, which is a pop filter, which protects the mic from potential saliva, but also those harsh sounds that I make with the P's and the T's, they're not as accentuated. But there's all little bits and pieces that podcasters like to use, but just start with those 3. Mic, headphones are a definite must, and a laptop, because you need to be able to edit and record and all that kind of, and write your show notes. So those are my 3.
Yeah, and I love it, because I think I get a lot of ask about the equipment as well, because I think people get so hung up on the equipment.
Yeah.
It's like, the equipment is the least of your worries, to be very honest.
Yeah, it's a small fraction.
It's a small fracture, it's just an additional tools that you need to get. But I think the content is one of the biggest aspects. And I love what you spoke about, the batching. Funny enough, even these days, when I talk to people about batching content, they're like, batching? I've never heard of that term. It's like, oh my gosh, I need to introduce you to batching. So here's an example of what I did last year, and it worked phenomenally well. So last year, as an example, March, April, I had 4 weeks available where I had people scheduled to have interviews with me to come on my podcast as a guest. And I had back-to-back interviews with people throughout the whole of April. I had enough interviews done in that month of April, I think it was, or was it March? I can't remember. But I had enough interviews done within that 1 month that then gave me content that I could drip feed out for the rest of the year. When I got to the end of last year, December, January, I was like, okay, now I'm getting to the end of my content. So I had to block some time out again to get more people to get onto the podcast. So I got more guests, did more interviews, and I had enough content that again lasted me all the way in the beginning of this year.
Yeah.
So that's what we talk about when we talk about batching. It's about scheduling some time where the only thing you concentrate on is creating content.
Yes.
That you can then take and then drip feed it out. And then as you get closer to the end, create that time again. Put it in your calendar, and then just create content, whether you're doing it solo, whether you're getting people on for interviewing as guests on the podcast. That's the beauty of batching, because you don't have to do it all the time. You do it once or twice or 3 times a year, depending on how well you want to do it. And then you've just got content that you can drip feed out throughout the time. You almost forget sometimes even. It's like, oh yeah, I forgot about that episode. I forgot that was going out today. Anyway, I shouldn't say that out loud, but that's true because...
But no, you do, because you're so organized.
Exactly.
When I schedule my content and then Instagram starts to ping, I'm like, what's going on? Because I literally forget that I've scheduled my posts. So then when people start engaging with them and obviously the notifications come, I was like, oh yeah. What did I post about today? I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah. But that's the beauty of batching, and this is something I could talk about forever, but that's the beauty of it, because you're not on the back foot. You're not thinking, oh my gosh, I've got to create something, which I did in the beginning. And you feel so unorganized and you feel so under pressure in order to get something out there. And here's the thing, when you create content because you're under pressure, you do not create content with the right energy, which means that the people receiving it on the other side is not going to receive it with the right energy, and they're not going to engage with it. And this is where I find that a lot of people say, but my content is great, but people are not engaging with this. Like, how did you create that content? Did you create it with the right energy, or were you under pressure? And did you just feel like, I just got to get something out for the sake of it? And it didn't really resonate then with the audience. With batching, you can honestly take the time to provide real value so that people then can receive it with that value. And obviously then you will really find a lot more engagement on the content. So just a little tip from my side there.
Yeah.
But no, I absolutely love the tips that you've given. And I think, when it comes to the equipment in particular, I mean, we're using Zoom. It's free.
Yeah.
You can use Zoom. You spoke about, using the content and then using it on all the other platforms. As an example, we record things here on Zoom and I take the video and I put it on my YouTube channel. The audio goes out on all the podcast channels, but then I use all my social media platforms in order to talk about the podcast episode. So I repurpose one episode constantly. And I think that's also the other great thing, because I don't have to create content for all the other platforms. I just use one piece of content and I repurpose it throughout. Again, it's just about being a bit clever with it. But it shows what you could do if podcasting is your thing. You can really do a lot with it.
Indeed.
So let's swing this around a little bit, because we spoke about creating your own podcast. But I think for a lot of people, there's also the option then of going to be a guest on other people's podcasts. So what would you say would be a good thing to do to be a guest? Or how are you a good guest for other people on their podcast?
So, as you mentioned, being a guest is a great way to kind of dip your toe in the pond. As a guest, you show up, you have a great conversation. Ideally, you'd promote when your episode is released. That's it. There's no more work. There's no editing. There's no thinking about topics. There's no, the tech isn't working. That's literally it. So if you are thinking about, should I start a podcast? Definitely be a guest. There's so many different ways. So number one, you could have a look on your favorite podcast platform, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Google, wherever it is you listen. And say, for instance, you are looking to be on a podcast about marketing, that's whatever your niche is or your topic, your passionate topic that we talked about, and do a bit of a search. So just pop in that phrase, keyword into the search bar and see what comes up. There's lots of podcasts, so you will get a few. There's lots and lots of different categories, but just have a look, see what stands out to you. I like to say to make a list of 10. So there might not be the first 10, just really take some time. Like Henriette was talking about in terms of batching, you do want to commit some time to this process. This is the most time consuming of the options that I'm going to talk to you about, but you put the time in and it can reap rewards. So make a list of 10. And then out of those 10, pick 3 or 4 that you think, oh, those are the ones that I would love to be on. And then I recommend listening to a couple episodes just to get a flavor of how the show is run, the kind of conversations they talk about. But most importantly, in your email pitch to the host, it's fantastic if you are able to put one of the key things that you took away from those episodes. They will see, because I guarantee you guys, they receive so many pitches every single day of the year. So by you putting something in that they know you could have only got by listening to the episode, they will know immediately that you've put in an effort and this is something that you're clearly interested in. So that's my top tip. And then in the email, personalize. So, you're reaching out to these 3, 4 initially. Don't just copy and paste. It might be that the second paragraph is your key takeaway personalized paragraph, and that's the one that you change for each one. And then you just shoot it off. Finding their email address should be super easy. Most people have it in their show notes, or if you click over to their website, it will be somewhere on their podcast page. So don't worry too much about where do I find contact details, or on their Instagram. There's lots of different ways. So that's one way. Second way, there are lots of podcast guest platforms. I have a client who uses Podbooker is one, Matchmaker, I think, is another one. I'm not sure if there's a fee involved, but she loves it. I mean, people are always, even this morning, there was like 3 messages. So the people are always emailing her, asking her to be a guest on their podcast, or sometimes vice versa. I've listened to your podcast. I'd love to guest. Here is what I can contribute. Oh, and that's another thing. Apologies, I missed out. In your pitch, you want to be clear about what value you're bringing, because as podcasters, our listeners are number one present in our minds. So just don't waffle on about, oh, I do this and I'm so amazing. What can you bring to their listenership? So those are the 2 top bits, your key takeaways from the episode, and then also what can you bring? What will their listeners learn? So back to the platforms. So Podbooker, Matchmaker. And then the third thing also would be Facebook groups. I have seen a number of posts, whether it's in entrepreneurial groups or specific podcaster groups. Check the rules, because Facebook groups, they love a bit of rules. But I have definitely seen posts, hey, I'm Rosemarie, I'm a podcast manager, I can talk all day about podcasting. Who's looking, for example? Who's looking for a guest? Or you might be a bit more specific, hey, I'm such, this is what I do, I'm looking to be a guest on X podcast. Is there anyone looking? And I've seen lots of those posts where, you're into the hundreds of comments, because scheduling, anything guest management, as I well know, takes a lot of time. So by you posting, you've already cut out half of the work for them by putting yourself forward. So those are the top 3 ways. But of course, the first one, as I mentioned, does require a bit more work on your side. But if you're strategic and you get those bigger ones that the big fish, so to speak, that are top of your list, who knows what results, what opportunities they will bring. So sometimes you've got to, put in the work to get those rewards.
Yeah. And I couldn't agree with you more, because I remember when I started reaching out to be a guest on other people's podcasts, that is exactly what I did. And yes, it does take a bit of time. And yes, you've got to reach out to about 10 people to have about 1 or 2 people actually replying to you. But it's well worth it, because once you get the ball rolling, then you realize, oh my gosh, yes, people are actually coming back to me.
Yeah.
And yes, it does take a little bit of hard work at the end, but I've gotten to a point now where people are actually contacting me to be guests on their podcasts. So I don't physically have to go out anymore in order to apply for being a guest. Yes, I will say this, I started getting a VA to help me reaching out to other people in order to be a guest. But it got to a point where I was constantly contacted by other people, which is a great place to be at. But you've got to put the hard work in first in order to showcase that. And then as you're building your visibility around being a guest, where you've been featured in, then other podcasters will see that and they'll go, oh, she's already been XYZ. Maybe I need to reach out to her. And that's a great place to be at. But you've got to start somewhere. One of the strategies, like you said, you go on podcasts. One of the strategies that I did as well is I went on Pinterest. Because a lot of podcasters use Pinterest to go and create pins for their episodes. And I do exactly the same. So I go on Pinterest, go look at podcasters, go check to see if they're the right fit for me. And then I reach out to them and see if they want a guest on their podcast. And that's how I started as well. And it was actually fun at the end of the day, because you get to meet really amazing people. I think that was the real thing that I really enjoyed, is getting to have these conversations, just meet people from all over the world. And you would have never gotten that connection if you just didn't, get over that fear of what if. And just reaching out, that's Definitely. Just the thrill of it all, I guess. For me in particular, I don't know about other people, but for me it was.
Yeah, very good point, definitely.
So everybody listening to this now or watching this video, I think Rosemarie is giving you some great tips as to how to start your podcast. If this is your thing, then, just really look into it. Go, as she said, just try being a guest somewhere and just get a feel for it. Start listening to some podcasts, see what it is that you can do. How does it work within your timeline, with your strategy? Can this be something that you're committed to become more consistent? Do you have enough content that you can put forward, or are you going to get interviews so you can obviously use other people's content on the podcast? And then if you really, really, really don't feel that you've got it all figured out, well, my suggestion is just go and talk to Rosemarie. Because she's the girl to talk to. She honestly knows how to get a podcast off the ground. And this is what she does. She helps people get a podcast off the ground, helps putting it all in place. So if you don't know where, what, when, what do I need to do? What do I need to set up? What do I need to avoid? She can help you with that. So Rosemarie, I just wanted to say thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for sharing all of these tips and helping everybody out, just to, how can I say, plant that little seed for those of you who are thinking about it, for those of you who already thought about it, but you feel now's the time to take the action. By all means, get in touch with Rosemarie.
Yeah.
Before we go though, Rosemarie, you've got an amazing freebie. You've got kind of like a roadmap to help people to launch their podcast. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this roadmap?
Yes. So as I mentioned a bit earlier, I like things simple. Simple is best. I like to break things down. So the roadmap is broken down into those 4 Ps, the 4 phases, as I mentioned, which are prep, produce, publish, and promote. And the freebie just kind of gives you a guide of what you need to do. We talked a little bit about the preps phase earlier. So yeah, if you wanted to know about the other 3 phases, feel free to grab a copy. And I'm here if you've got any questions.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for making that available. So what we'll do is Rosemarie's details for this roadmap will be down in the show notes. So by all means, go and click on it so you can download your copy now. And then we'll also make sure that you have the website for Rosemarie there at the bottom. The social media links will be there as well, so you can go and stalk her and check out what she's all about. But at the end of the day, it's just really about deciding, is podcasting for you? Do you want to go on this journey? And if you do, are you going to be committed to it? Are you going to be consistent with it? And if you need some help, just reach out to Rosemarie. I'm sure she'd be more than happy to have a chat with you to see how she can help you put everything in place, especially if you're starting out. Or on the other side, like me, I needed help because I didn't have the time anymore to do all of the podcasting. So yes, I still do the interviews, but when it comes to the editing, putting everything together, Rosemarie's the girl. She is absolutely the best thing that I could have made a decision on in my life and in my business. So thank you, Rosemarie, from a personal note, for being my podcast VA. I honestly could not have done this without you.
Oh, you're most welcome.
Oh, bless you. Well, listen, thank you so much for being here. I'm sure the audience really enjoyed this and got a great few tips from you. But you and I will chat very soon again, that's for sure.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Enjoy your day. And we'll speak soon.
Speak soon.
Bye-bye.